On the afternoon of the 11th of October, 1873, the Boston Searsport steam packet docked at the long stone and timber breakwater of Searsport, Maine, at 20 minutes past 3 o'clock, and a man came down the gangway carrying a single brown leather valise and asked the harbor clerk for directions to the cottage of Mrs. Tabitha Hench. The harbor clerk, a 30-year-old Searsport native named Asa Pendleton, looked at the man for a moment before answering. The man was 41 years old by his own appearance, lean and weathered, deeply sun-darkened in a manner unusual on the Maine coast, with short, cropped, dark brown hair, gone iron gray at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard, streaked with gray, deep, clear gray-blue eyes, a missing left earlobe, and a small white scar near his right eye. Asa Pendleton thought, in the moment before he answered, that he recognized the man. He thought, in the moment after that he could not be quite sure. He gave the man the directions. The man walked up the lane from the harbor with his single leather valise and turned at the second crossroad and walked the last half-mile to the small, white, shingled clapboard cottage on the quiet lane at the western edge of the town that he had known to be the house of Mrs. Tabitha Hench. He arrived at the small front porch at 20 minutes past 4. He set the valise down on the bench beside the front door. He stood very still for a long moment, looking at the door. Then he raised his hand and knocked. The door was opened by a 37-year-old woman of English-American descent, slim, graceful build, honey-brown hair pinned up loosely in a low knot with strands escaping around her face, warm, dark gray eyes alert and steady. Wearing a dark, slate-blue wool dress with a high collar buttoned to the throat and a faded cream linen apron, a thin gold wedding band on her left hand. She was Tabitha Hench. She had been a widow for 9 years. She looked at the man at her door for a long moment. The man removed his hat. He said in a careful, steady voice that had a slight quality to it she could not immediately place, that he was Adam Hench. He said he had been rescued from the wreck of the Mercury in the autumn of 1864 by a Hawaiian whaler. He said he had been working his way home through the Pacific and South America and across the Atlantic for the last 9 years. He said he was sorry he was so late. He said he understood if she could not receive him at the door. Tabitha Hench looked at the man. She did not say anything for what was perhaps a full minute. Then she stood aside and held the door wider and asked him in. To understand what happened in the parlor of the Hench cottage in Searsport, Maine on the afternoon of the 11th of October, 1873, and over the 22 years in the second journal that followed, the listener must go back to the beginning, to the marriage that had brought Tabitha and Adam Hench to that cottage in 1859. Adam Hench had been 30 years old in 1862. He had been a Searsport fisherman, the third son of a long Searsport coastal family, a strong, steady young man without much imagination and without much book learning, but kind and honest in his small way and faithful in his attentions to Tabitha Prescott of Belfast, whom he had courted for 2 years before he had married her in the spring of 1859 at the small Methodist chapel at the center of Searsport. He had been a man of practical Maine coastal seamanship. He had known knots and weather and the running of a small fishing dory in any sea. He had been an able seaman by every Maine coastal standard. He had not, however, known how to read. He had not been to school more than the 4 winters of the Searsport schoolhouse during his childhood, and the schoolhouse had taught him only the rudiments of arithmetic, and he had left school at the age of 11 to fish with his father, and he had remained functionally illiterate for the next 19 years of his life. Tabitha, who had been the schoolmaster's daughter at Belfast and who had read everything in her father's small library before her marriage, had not minded her husband's illiteracy. She had read to him in the long evenings of their 3-year marriage. She had taught him to write his name in a careful, slow, shaking hand. She had not taught him further. He had not asked. They had had 1 daughter, born in the spring of 1861. They had named her Phoebe. Adam had loved the child completely. In the autumn of 1861, when their daughter was 6 months old, Adam Hench had been recruited as a second mate by the New Bedford whaling bark Mercury. then refitting at Boston for a long Pacific voyage. The Mercury had been short of mates and had been offering generous wages for the right kind of competent Maine coastal sailor. Adam Hench had been such a sailor. He had taken the offer in the autumn of 1861. He had sailed from New Bedford on the Mercury on the 3rd of February, 1862, bound for the Pacific whaling grounds. He had promised Tabitha he would be home within 4 years. He had written her 2 letters during the first year of the voyage, both of them dictated to other men aboard the Mercury and signed with his slow, shaking hand. The letters were posted from Valparaiso in the spring of 1863. They were the last words Tabitha received from Adam Hench. The Mercury was reported lost with all hands on the 17th of November, 1864, struck by a typhoon 400 miles east of the Caroline Islands. A small piece of her stern with the partial nameplate had been recovered by a Hawaiian whaler some weeks later. No survivors had been reported. The Boston shipping office of the Mercury's owners had written to Tabitha Hench in February of 1865 with the official notification. Tabitha had been 28 years old at the receipt of the notification. Phoebe had been 4 years old. The 2 letters from Valparaiso had been Tabitha's only correspondence from her husband for the past 3 years. Tabitha Hench had lived as a widow for the next 9 years. She had not remarried. She had kept the small cottage at the western edge of Searsport. She had taken in piecework sewing from the Searsport shipping families and from the small Searsport dressmaker who maintained the town's small, ready-made trade. She had raised Phoebe Hench. There had been 3 quiet proposals over the years, from Searsport widowers and from one bachelor master of a coasting schooner, and Tabitha had declined all 3. She had explained her declinings to no one. She had walked Phoebe to the small Searsport schoolhouse every weekday morning at 8:30. She had attended the small Methodist chapel at the center of the town twice a Sunday. She had read in the long evenings from her father's old small library that she had brought to Searsport at her marriage. She had grown to be the kind of quiet, self-possessed widow that small Maine coastal towns produced in the latter half of the 19th century, neither cold nor warm, but watchful, patient, kind in small, careful ways, given to occasional small smiles but rarely to laughter. Phoebe Hench had been 12 years old on the afternoon. The man knocked at the door. She had been in the upstairs bedroom doing her algebra at her small writing desk when she had heard her mother open the front door and not say anything for a long minute. And then she had heard her mother ask the visitor in, and she had come down the narrow stairs to the parlor and had stopped on the 3rd stair from the bottom and had looked at the man in the dark, gray traveling suit standing in the parlor and at her mother facing him from across the parlor rug, and she had not recognized the man because she had been 1 year old when her father had sailed. The man had looked at her. He had said in his careful voice that he was her father. He had asked her if she remembered him. Phoebe had said honestly that she did not. The man had nodded once. He had said that he had not expected her to. He had said he had a small, carved coquilla nut on a leather thong from a man who had known her as a baby on the Mercury before the wreck, that her father had carved her name into it on the night of her first birthday at sea, and that he would like her to have it if she would accept it from him. He had taken the small coquilla nut on its leather thong from his pocket and had held it out to her at the foot of the parlor stairs. Phoebe had taken it carefully. She had turned it over in her hand. She had read, carved in small, careful letters in the side of the coquilla nut, the word Phoebe in the same slow, shaking hand her mother had once shown her as her father's signature on her parents' marriage certificate. Tabitha Hench had watched her daughter take the coquilla nut. She had watched the man's face as he had given it. She had thought, in the moment her daughter had taken the small carved nut from the man's hand, that there were things she would have to think about in the next many days. She had said only, in her steady, measured voice, that she would put on water for tea. The man and the woman and the daughter sat together at the parlor table that afternoon for the next 4 hours. The man told them, in his slow, careful voice, the story of the wreck of the Mercury, the typhoon, the breaking up of the hull, the drowning of the crew, his own survival on a broken section of the stern, his rescue 12 days later by the Hawaiian whaler Mahalo under Captain Lawrence Pecoy, his slow recovery of strength, his subsequent year working as a hand on the Mahalo through the Pacific, his eventual landing at Honolulu in 1866, his successive berths on various Pacific and South American coasting vessels, his attempts to send letters home. He produced 2 undelivered envelopes addressed to Tabitha Hench, Searsport, Maine. The envelopes addressed in a careful, neat hand Tabitha had never seen before, but which the man explained he had had a fellow seaman write for him, because his own hand was not yet what it had been. His slow work across the Atlantic during the previous year, his arrival at last in Boston the previous week, his deciding to come up by the daily packet rather than by horse and carriage, his standing on the breakwater at 3 o'clock that afternoon, looking up the slope at the town he had not seen in 11 years. Tabitha listened. She asked him near the end of the 4 hours 3 specific questions. She asked him the maiden name of her mother. The man said her mother's maiden name had been Cushing. This was correct. She asked him where her late father had kept the small wooden box of his own father's papers. The man said it had been in the bottom of the dark walnut chest, in the small back bedroom of the Belfast house. This was correct. She asked him to tell her the small song her mother had once sung to her as a child, which she had taught her husband on the first morning of their honeymoon at Castine, when they had been walking together along the rocks at low tide, and Tabitha had hummed it without thinking. The man hummed the song. The melody was correct. The man knew 6 words of the lyrics. This was correct, and was the most specific and unguessable test, and Tabitha had been holding it for the end. Tabitha sat very still for a long moment in her parlor chair. Then she nodded once. She told the man he could sleep in the front bedroom that night. She said they would see what they would see in the morning. Before this story goes on, before what Tabitha Hench learned over the next 12 months and the long, quiet decision she made in the autumn of 1874, the teller must ask the listener something. If you have ever opened the door to someone you had not expected to see, and have spent the next hours of your life trying to decide whether the person at your table was the person you had been waiting for, please tap the like button below. And if you are new to Salt and Lantern, subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of the sea. Now the story will go on. Adam Hench stayed in the front bedroom that first night. He stayed in the front bedroom every night for the next 4 months. He was patient. He did not press for the resumption of the marriage. He occupied himself in those months with the small, visible reintegration of a returned man into the life of his Searsport. Visits to his elderly father, who had recognized him at first sight and had wept. Visits to his 2 surviving brothers, who had been slower to recognize him but had accepted him within the first week. Formal calls upon the small Methodist minister, formal calls upon the 2 Searsport shipping firms with whom he hoped to find a clerk's position, and small daily walks with Phoebe down to the harbor at 4 o'clock to look at the vessels at the breakwater. Phoebe came to like him over those 4 months. She watched him with the quiet curiosity of a 12-year-old girl who had grown up with the abstract idea of a father and was now living with the concrete, particular version. He was gentle with her. He answered her questions about the Pacific. He helped her with her algebra. He told her he was sorry he had not been there for the first 11 years. He did not press her to call him father, although Phoebe by the end of the 2nd month was calling him so naturally. He took a clerk's position at the Pendleton Shipping Company in February of 1874. The position was at $12 a week and included the small upstairs office with a dark oak roll-top desk that he would use for the next 21 years of his life. He moved into the marriage bedroom in the 2nd week of February, 1874, at Tabitha's quiet invitation. The marriage resumed. They had no further children. They were not unhappy. Tabitha had begun to notice things in the first 3 months. He read fluently. He read in the parlor every evening, sometimes from her father's old books, and sometimes from the small library of his own that he had begun to acquire from the Searsport bookseller. Volumes of practical mathematics, of celestial navigation, of Lyell's Principles of Geology, of an English translation of Hugo's Les Miserables. He wrote letters in a careful, neat, copper-plate hand. He computed in his head the compound interest on a small loan the Pendleton Shipping Company had made to a Bangor shipper in 1872. and he produced the answer to within 4 cents in under 30 seconds at the parlor table one Tuesday evening in March. And Tabitha, who had set the table for supper while she watched him do this, had set down the plate she had been carrying and had looked at her husband for a long moment. He had spoken 3 times in his sleep in French in the 2nd month. Tabitha had listened from her side of the bed in the dark and had been able to make out the words Suleiman and Pardonne and the name Lawrence. He had ordered a Spanish-language newspaper from Boston in March on the standing arrangement that the Searsport bookseller would forward it to him weekly. He had once on a Sunday walked to the harbor with Phoebe in April, tied for Phoebe at her request a sailor's knot Tabitha did not recognize, a small, flat, decorative knot that Phoebe had asked him to make for her hair ribbon. And Phoebe had asked her father the name of the knot, and the man had said it was a Polynesian knot. Adam Hench had not known how to read. Adam Hench had not spoken French. Adam Hench had not known compound interest. Adam Hench had not known any Polynesian knots. Tabitha Hench had been the only person who had been close enough to Adam Hench in the years before his sailing to know all of these things. She had not, in those first months, said anything to the man in her bed. She had watched, she had thought, she had watched her daughter come to love him. She had thought about the 4 years of the marriage before he sailed. She had thought about who she had been in those years and who she was now. She had thought about a great many things. The thing about the difference between knowing and not knowing, Tabitha discovered through that long first year, was that it could be held in suspension if a woman were sufficiently practiced in the holding of difficult things in suspension. She had been a widow for 9 years before the man had come home. She had learned in those 9 years how to live with things that could not be settled. The fact of her husband possibly not being her husband in the months between October 1873 and October 1874 settled into the small place in her mind where she kept the other unsettled things, and she lived with it, and she watched, and she let the man be her husband in the way that he wished to be her husband, and she let Phoebe call him father, and she went on. She had moments in those months that she thought might break the suspension. There was the evening in late February when the man had read aloud from a small new volume of Tennyson's poetry he had brought home from the Searsport bookseller, and Tabitha, who had been mending one of Phoebe's pinafores at her parlor chair, had looked up and had seen her husband, who could not have read aloud from any book at all in 1862, reading the long stanzas of Idylls of the King in a clear, measured voice, with the small, private pleasure of a man who had loved the words for years. And Tabitha had set down her mending and had sat for a long moment, looking at him without his noticing, and she had felt the suspension waver. There was the morning in early April when the Pendleton Shipping Company had sent a junior clerk to the cottage with a small leather portfolio of papers that the man needed to review at home that evening. And the junior clerk had said, on the front porch with his cap in his hand, that the senior clerk had told him that Mr. Hench had the finest hand for fair copying contracts of any clerk in the firm, and that the firm considered itself fortunate to have him. Tabitha had thanked the junior clerk and had taken the portfolio inside and had set it on the writing desk, and she had stood at the writing desk for a long moment, with her hand resting on the leather cover, and she had felt the suspension waver again. There was the night in the 2nd week of June when the man had called out something in his sleep in French, clearer than the earlier French dream utterances, 3 words, "Ne me pardonne pas," and Tabitha had lain awake in the dark for the next 2 hours beside him. She had not, in any of those moments, said anything. She had held the suspension. On the morning of the 11th of October, 1874, she had woken at 5 and had lain in bed in the soft, gray, early light beside her sleeping husband. And she had decided that the suspension had gone on long enough, and that she would, on the following Sunday afternoon, when the man was at chapel, look in the bottom of his sea chest. On the afternoon of the 11th of October, 1874, a Sunday afternoon a year to the day after the man had knocked at her door, Tabitha Hench went into the front bedroom while the man was at the Methodist chapel, and she opened the bottom drawer of his sea chest, and she took out a small, leather-bound personal journal in calf-brown leather with a black silk ribbon marker. She had seen him write in it on a number of evenings. She had not, in any previous instance, opened it. She opened it now. The journal began on the first page with a careful entry dated the 3rd of October, 1862, the date of Adam Hench's sailing on the Mercury, and continued through entries purporting to cover the years of the Pacific whaling voyage and the wreck of 1864 and the subsequent years of the return. The handwriting was a careful, neat copperplate throughout. The entries were detailed and consistent with what the man had told her. The earlier entries, however, the entries purporting to cover Adam Hench's life before 1862, his childhood at Searsport, his courtship of Tabitha at Belfast, the marriage in 1859, the birth of Phoebe in 1861, were also written in the same careful, neat copperplate. Tabitha turned to the page describing the wedding day. The handwriting was identical to the handwriting describing a 1869 Honolulu typhoon 4 pages later. She took a small, clean piece of blotting paper from the writing desk. She pressed it carefully against the freshly written entry of the previous Friday on a later page. She lifted the blotter. The ink lifted some small fragments off the page. Fresh ink lifts. She took a second piece of blotting paper. She pressed it carefully against the page, describing the wedding day of 1859. She lifted the blotter. The ink lifted some small fragments off the page also. The ink was fractionally less aged than the most recent entries, but only fractionally. The page describing 1859 had been written, by her best judgment, within the previous 12 months. Tabitha Hench closed the journal. She put it back in the bottom of the sea chest, exactly as she had found it. She left the front bedroom. She went down to the parlor. She sat in her usual parlor chair. She waited for the man to come home from the chapel. He came home at 4:30. He told her about the morning sermon. They had tea. They had supper. They went to bed. She said nothing. She said nothing about the journal that night, and she said nothing about it the next morning, and she said nothing about it in the next 21 years of his life. She had decided, sitting in her parlor chair on the Sunday afternoon of the 11th of October, 1874, that she did not know who the man in her bed was, and that she did not need to know. She had decided that the man was kind, that he was a better husband than Adam Hench had been. Adam Hench had been kind too, but in the limited, careful kindness of a man, with limited, careful imagination, while this man's kindness was wide and patient and read poetry to her in the long evenings, that he was wonderful with Phoebe, and that the household he had assembled from whatever materials he had brought back with him was a household she did not wish to disturb. She had also decided that if she was wrong about him, if the man had killed her husband, if he had stolen another man's identity for some malicious purpose, if he was waiting to do something terrible, she would know the wrongness within a year, and that as it was now the 11th of October, 1874, and she had felt no wrongness in any of the 4 months he had been her husband again, she was likely not wrong. She was not wrong. The man lived as Adam Hench in Searsport, Maine for the next 21 years. He was a quiet, careful clerk at the Pendleton Shipping Company. He rose to the head clerkship by 1881 and was made a junior partner of the firm in 1888. He raised Phoebe as his own daughter. He gave her away in marriage in the spring of 1889 to a young Searsport ship's chandler named Henry Vance. He held his first grandchild, Phoebe's son Edmund, in 1891. He held his second, Phoebe's daughter Tabitha, in 1893. He died on the morning of the 7th of June, 1895, of a sudden seizure of the heart while reading the Searsport Eastern Argus at the breakfast table. He was 63 years old by his own account. Tabitha Hench buried him 3 days later in the small Searsport burying ground at the western edge of the town. The wooden marker she had ordered read, Adam Hench, 1832-1895, loving husband and father. The marker remained until her own death in 1913, at which time their daughter Phoebe replaced the wooden marker with a small gray granite stone bearing the same inscription. 2 weeks after the funeral, on a quiet afternoon in late June 1895, Tabitha Hench went up to the small upstairs office at the Pendleton Shipping Company that Adam had used for 21 years and that the company had told her she might empty at her convenience. She went through his roll-top desk. The papers were what she had expected. 21 years of shipping correspondence, small personal notes, a small accounts book of household expenses, a small collection of unfinished letters in his neat hand. She went through the small lockable drawer at the lower right. She used a small brass key she had taken from his pocket the morning of his death. Inside the drawer she found, beneath a small folder of personal correspondence, a second, smaller leather-bound personal journal she had not previously known to exist. The cover was plain brown leather without a marker ribbon. The journal was dated on the first page, the 17th of October, 1871, 2 years before the man had appeared at her door. The journal was a record of preparation. The first entries, written in Honolulu in October and November 1871, described the writer's situation. His real name, Etienne Kalehua, born 1832 in Honolulu, to a French wine merchant father and a Hawaiian mother. His service as first mate on the Hawaiian whaler Mahalo under Captain Lawrence Pecoy from 1860 to 1869. His witness of the Mahalo's recovery in November 1864 of the survivors of the wreck of the New Bedford whaling bark Mercury. His nursing for 12 days of the dying second mate Adam Hench of Searsport, Maine. His sitting at Adam Hench's bedside as Adam, in the last hours of his life, had told him in great detail the entire story of his Searsport childhood, his marriage to Tabitha Prescott of Belfast, his daughter Phoebe born in 1861, the small lullaby Tabitha's mother had sung that Tabitha had taught Adam at Castine, the location of every memory and every small detail Adam could think to give in the last hours of his life, and Adam's dying request that Etienne find Tabitha if he ever made his way to Maine, and tell her that her husband had loved her and had been thinking of her in his last hours, and had been sorry he had not come home. Etienne had given the promise. The subsequent entries, written in Honolulu and San Francisco and Boston and Wiscasset and finally at Searsport itself in 1871 through 1873, recorded Etienne's growing decision, initially against the idea, then increasingly in favor of it, to do more than fulfill the simple promise. The entries recorded his interviews with old sailors who had known Adam Hench in his Searsport youth, conducted under various names in various waterfront taverns of New Bedford and Boston, where Searsport men in those years could often be found. The entries recorded his visit to Searsport itself in October 1872, 12 months before the eventual return, under the name Lawrence Brown of San Francisco, a visit during which Etienne had walked the streets of Searsport, attended the Methodist chapel, observed Tabitha Hench at the harbor breakwater on a Tuesday afternoon as she walked her daughter to the small dock to meet the Boston packet, and had concluded that the woman was being slowly destroyed by the absence of her husband. The entries recorded Etienne's reasoning. He had his own reasons to disappear from his Hawaiian French past, which the journal alluded to without entirely specifying, a debt of honor to a man in Honolulu, an old understanding with a Hawaiian woman to whom he could not now return as the man he had become. He had calculated that the best service he could render to Adam Hench's memory and to Tabitha Hench's grief and to his own need to begin again was to become Adam Hench. He had prepared for 14 further months. He had returned in October 1873. The journal ended on the 7th of August, 1873, with a final entry. I am ready. I shall sail for Boston tomorrow morning. May the man whose life I am about to take up forgive me, and may his wife forgive me also if she discovers what I have done, and may the small daughter I am about to meet for the first time grow up loved by what I am bringing her, in place of what she lost. I do not know yet whether what I am about to do is a kindness or a violation. I have decided to believe it is a kindness. Tabitha Hench sat at the roll-top desk in the small upstairs office for what was perhaps an hour and a half, with the second journal open on her lap. Then she closed the journal. She wrapped it in a clean cotton handkerchief. She took it home in her market basket. She placed it on the kitchen plank table that evening. She lit the iron stove. She sat in front of the open stove door with the journal in her hands. She read it once more, from beginning to end. Then she dropped the journal into the burning stove. She watched it burn until the leather had blackened and the pages had curled into ash. She closed the stove door. She had not told her daughter Phoebe about the first journal in 1874, and she had not told her daughter about the second journal in 1895, and she did not tell her in the 18 years that followed. Tabitha Hench lived alone in the small, white-shingled cottage at the western edge of Searsport. For the next 18 years, she kept her piecework sewing. She had her grandchildren visit her every Sunday afternoon. She read in the long evenings from her father's old library. She did not remarry. She died on the 3rd of March, 1913, at the age of 77 of pneumonia, in the same iron bedstead her two husbands had each occupied beside her. Phoebe Hench Vance, then 52 years old and a Searsport school teacher with her own two grown children, sat at her mother's bedside for the last 3 days after her mother's funeral. Phoebe was given the task of clearing out the cottage. In the back of her mother's writing desk, in the parlor, in a small folded square of cream linen, Phoebe found the first journal, the calf-brown leather journal of Adam Hench, with the black silk ribbon marker that her father had kept for his 21 years at Searsport. Beneath the journal, folded into a small sealed envelope, addressed in her mother's neat hand, to my daughter Phoebe, Phoebe found a single sheet of paper in her mother's writing. The letter said only the following: "This was your stepfather's journal. He was not your father. Your father died in 1864 on the Mercury, as we were told. The man who came home in 1873 was a Hawaiian-French sailor named Etienne Kalahua, who had been at your father's bedside in his last hours and had promised your father to come and tell me what he had to say. Etienne decided, after 14 months of consideration, to come and tell me by becoming him. I knew this within a year. I did not tell him I knew. He was a kinder husband to me than your father had been, and a better father to you than your father had had the time to become. He loved you completely. He is buried beside the cottage. The journal you are holding was his. I burned the second journal, his preparation journal, in the kitchen stove on the day of his funeral. There is no one left now who knows what I am telling you, and you may choose what to do with what I have written. I leave the choice in your hands as he and I would both have wished it. Your loving mother, Tabitha Prescott Hench." Phoebe Hench Vance read the letter twice in the empty parlor of her mother's cottage on the afternoon of the funeral. She did not burn it. She kept the letter and the first journal in her own desk for the next 2 years. She thought about her stepfather, who she had loved without reservation for 21 years, and who had given her in marriage and had held her 2 children. She thought about her mother. She thought about the man called Etienne Kalahua of Honolulu, who had decided to become the father she had never quite known. In the spring of 1916, she gave the journal and her mother's letter to the editor of the Searsport Eastern Argus for publication. The story ran in 3 parts in March of 1916. It was picked up by the Boston Globe and the Portland Press Herald. It was read in the maritime communities of the New England coast. By 1916, all of the principals were dead except Phoebe herself, who lived another 23 years in Searsport, taught school for 38 years, and died in 1939 at the age of 78, having spoken openly to anyone who asked her about her 2 fathers, Adam Hench of Searsport, who had died on the Mercury in 1864, and Etienne Kalahua of Honolulu, who had loved her and her mother for 22 years in his place. Thank you for listening to this story from Salt and Lantern. If it has moved you, or if you have ever known what it is to be loved by someone who came to you in a form other than the one you had been waiting for, please leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from, and subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of the sea. Good night, and may your own light burn steady through whatever storm comes next.